Okay, you can start.
All right, so let's share. Give me a second, trying to understand how this is going to work, because this is a very different device than usual. System layout, docs. Is everyone sees the screen? Everyone is seeing the screen correctly?
Yeah, I can see.
Perfect. So I'm not gonna go full screen because I actually really do like having the sidebar here in order for representation of what's going on. So let me be clear and make sense of things for everyone here. Today's lesson is very scientific. However, it does have a, let's say, a slight meditation angle by the end of it, but I won't go too quick. So let's first disclaimer. First disclaimer, this is not a serious presentation. I thought about making it very serious and going into the details and like going like way deeper than I should into the neuroscience of things about how brainwaves actually work, how you can actually use electroencephalograms to do many things. But I decided, no, let's make it simple, quick, but still insightful and useful as information. Also, because I'm using a new device and I'm using LibreOffice, this is PowerPoint. At least not in the normal PowerPoint. This is the free version of PowerPoint, which doesn't have a lot of the features that make it fancy. So I got inspired by a lot of what I saw in 2007 and 2009, when people were only discovering PowerPoint and when PowerPoint didn't have a bunch of automated features. So hopefully things still have their charm and everything is understandable. Feel free to interrupt me whenever you want to ask questions. I assure you, as much as this will be silly, there are actual sources to this stuff, and I have actually read the material. So let's get going. Here's the outline of what we will be discussing. So we're going to go through a quick brain recap, how a brain is, well, how it works. Some of the stuff when it comes to neural potential. This is specifically electric neuronal potential. The concepts of what brainwaves actually are. Finally, the part where we're probably mostly interested in is the yoga and meditation aspect. Now, you will understand why this is later in the presentation based on the first three ones we're going to be looking at. And finally, there's a little bit of extra by the end, stuff that I just found to be really neat for what we're doing here. So this is how a brain is. Now, admittedly, this is a basic representation of what a brain currently is in our scientific literature. I have omitted about, let's say, 20 or different kinds of separations we use for brains, and this is an image from Wikipedia that I found that is relatively accurate to the source and still is generalized but not completely incorrect. So the frontal lobe is usually something that develops later in a person's life, and it's what we use to make our decisions. It is also one of the larger part of our brain, and it's probably also the part that our brain have evolved the last. Something to note, by the way, is there's a ongoing theory in neuroscience as well as general evolution theory that the brain has grown layers based on the evolutionary tendencies of the whole species. So for instance, if you look closely, the cerebellum, or also called the old brain, is present in any kind of developed animal, including things like alligators. While things like the gyrus and the major temporal lobe, these things were added later. The frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe are thought to be the latest additions to the brain. And if you can see, there's layers on top of layers. And if you look at the left, there's a bit more of a description of what each part is responsible for. For instance, the occipital lobe is for visual processing. You would also consider that this is a very large part of our brain because guess what? Our eyes are very important. That being said, let's not go too deep into it. It's not that complicated for what we're trying to do. We just need a reminder of how a brain looks like and how it works. Because we are going into neurons. How do neurons actually work? And this is relevant for brainwave technology. Neurons are essentially a very specific type of electrical discharge that our bodies create by having a differentiation between the inner amount of potassium and the obvious and the outside potential of the cell itself. So what happens when a neuron discharges is that, sorry, sodium and potassium. What happens is when there is a critical level of either one or the other in the cell, the neuron discharges and there's an electrical output that happens. Now, something to note is that neurons are usually what we consider to be things that happen in our brain. But neurons are technically just evolved or specialized nerve cells. Nerve cells exist almost everywhere on your body that you can feel anything. In fact, the only reason you can feel pain or you can feel heat are just different forms of nerve nerve fibers communicating that information from different parts of your body to your brain. And fun fact, your brain itself cannot feel pain. When you have a hangover or you have a headache, there's a reason why you feel it on the periphery of your head and very rarely internally. It's because the brain itself cannot feel or has any pain receptors inside of it, which is why open brain surgery is a thing. Like, look it up. It's quite a gruesome sight, but it makes sense. Also, a side factor, neurotransmitters, which we will not be discussing in detail here, are important to the general brain activity, but it is considered currently that it is the potential of the actual discharge that dictates what amount of what is being transmitted with neurotransmitters. Well, let's not go into there. That's an entirely huge subject of science that just we don't have time to cover. But what we do have a time to cover is the actual discharge itself. Now, you might actually already guess why this is relevant. If you look at a discharge, what does it look like? It looks like a wave. And there's a reason for this. When a neuron discharges, it has a refractory period where essentially the reverse has to happen, where the potential got released through the exchange of potassium and calcium ions, of course, of these reactions between the membranes, and then it's trying to revert back to its normal standard state. The reason this matters is because most neurons don't fire randomly. If they are randomly firing, this is called epilepsy. And I'm not kidding to you, epilepsy has been categorized and is normally categorized in medical field as just an uncontrolled discharge of neurons. That's why it's so dangerous. It doesn't kill the person normally. What it does is that it forces your body to do a bunch of things it's not supposed to, and that's what puts you into danger. But that's also the reason why people with epilepsy can live very long, fulfilling lives despite the problem. They just need to lie down and make sure they don't break their bones while they're spazzing out. Now, all of this is to say is that when neurons communicate with each other, we use essentially a form of electrical magnetic communication, and that can be traced. So, onto the main part, electrical magnetic waves. So, what are exactly brainwaves? Brainwaves are essentially our way of understanding and corroborating different types of electric activity inside of our own bodies. Now, because our brain is usually the center of all this electrical activity, that's where all of these waves normally come from. However, if you've been in engineering or in biology or even in computer science, you will know that almost anything that has an electrical charge also has an electrical magnetic field and thus can generate waves. So technically, your finger while you move it is creating a bunch of waves, not just with the air, but also with the electrical impulses necessary to contract your muscles. That being said, we're concentrating specifically on the brain here because the brain is where all of our emotions, all of our thoughts, and all of our concepts of being exist, and why electrical magnetic waves and brain waves especially matter. Now, over time, we've accumulated a bit of an understanding of what waves correspond to what. And for instance, here you have a very simple distribution of the nomenclature of each wave. So for instance, gamma waves are considered to be the fastest waves and are usually associated with your active engagement. It's usually the ones that most frequently are responsible for your conscious decisions, your conscious thoughts. Things like delta and theta are mostly representative of things happening unconsciously on a more long-term basis, and thus their frequency is lower. Now, frequency in how that is correlated to the brain activity itself is also a whole bunch of math I would not recommend we go through right now. However, the TLDR is that the frequency of when and how things activate are what represents these frequencies. And just by the nature of thinking and doing things, gamma waves are the most frequent ones and also the ones that are most intense, which is the reason why a lot of things happen in gamma. However, as you can see, betas are just as relevant as well as the alphas and etc. They all play a role. And if you read out the slides, you can also see which parts are responsible for what, at least roughly speaking. It's worth noting that a lot of this is proven, but not fully. Most of science is very, let's say, they are 90% sure this is how it works. There's some details that are still missing to make this picture completely proof. So now, how do we actually measure these things and how do we know these things for sure? How we do this is through electroencephalography. Essentially, this is a non-invasive method of putting electrodes very close to your brain, and through the skull that you have in your membrane, we can calculate roughly what kind of electrical signals are coming from where in your brain. The challenge for a lot of the time was specifically to correlate which one of these signals from which part of your brain correspond to what in a person, and which is the reason why you have this part here. This used to be a very long roll of paper related to all of the separate nodes on the person's brain, which are specific patterns. And based on those patterns and which ones were activated at what point, with what strength, and with what frequency, it was possible to roughly correlate what kind of activity happened in what parts of the brain. Noteworthy is that open brain surgery in things like the recent Elon Musk chip were essentially delved further into this process and enabled even clearer and faster readings. While this version is fully functional, it is not fully accurate because, as you can guess, when a signal happens somewhere in the cerebellum and you're trying to read it from here, it's a bit hard. There's a lot of disruptions and there's a lot of stuff that may get in the way. So, how does all of this matter for our purposes, which is meditation? There is, let's say, there is a surprisingly large amount of relationships between the scientific field and variations of yogi traditions that relate one to the other. The following few slides, by the way, you should take with a massive grain of salt. These were sourced from primarily two different sources that were quite relevant, but still quite shaky. And some of the transitions from yogi and yoga are not particularly well translated into English. So for instance, some of you who are more versed in Sanskrit can always kind of discern that certain things may not fully make sense. But let me explain what the major purpose of all of this is. I'll just go through the slides slowly while I explain. The main idea behind a lot of these traditions is that yoga and yogi traditions in general allow a person to focus. Personally, they focus on the inner self, they focus on different aspects of their body. And many of these allow people to calm down and make sense of things. Now, what that means in terms of brain activity is that the more you engage in this kind of behavior, the more you become actively focused on a specific purpose and your brain activity starts to lower. One of the main things yogi do is that they remove the conscious mind as much as possible, which is considered to be the alpha waves. And by removing the alpha waves and specifically focusing on the betas, the thetas, the gammas, and the deltas, oh, sorry, there you go. Sorry about that. So alpha, beta, theta, gamma, and delta, they remove most of the alphas and they lower their brain activity to focus on the betas and the thetas. You engage in a process where a lot of what would normally be considered to be emotional, stressful, is removed from your brain, and you can, with uh, the focus of your brain waves, assume and understand how yogi traditions can slowly but surely engage you more in what would be considered a deeper state. What we don't fully understand in terms of the scientific field is the exact correlations between these kinds of activities and the exact effects they have. We have what are pretty much good guesswork at the moment, theories, but nothing is fully proven, as human experimentation, especially in a field as abstract as yoga, is, as you can probably guess, very difficult. But few things worth noting. When you, for instance, start to relax and you start to feel more calm, your alpha activity goes down and your beta activity goes up. But what that also means is that you gain more control over a subconscious part of your mind, which works on lower levels. What a lot of people don't fully realize is that your brain at all points in your life is active. There is at no point where there is no electrical activities in your brain. The only thing that changes is the type of electrical activity. Thus the type of waves that it produces. If you have no electrical activity, I'm sorry, but that means you're dead. You're just dead. So in order to focus on more deeper and more meaningful aspects of you, in order to remove the superfluous, for instance, frontal lobe activity that is not necessarily conductive to your inner thoughts or your inner relationships with your deeper self, you can remove these alpha waves. Now, just using tantric traditions is relatively difficult to do that. So let me give you a bit of a break and give you a bit more of a scientific but more straightforward way of making sure this works for you. Give me, there we go. There we go. The future is now, and you can use science to help yourself. There you go. One of the things that I really wanted to mention in this little class is something that a lot of people may not be aware of, is that brainwave therapy is a thing. Now, what is it exactly? And brainwave therapy is currently a disputed but surprisingly popular way of doing therapy. And therapy, but
Max, no sound.
I just died.
You went beyond delta waves.
Exactly. Just give me a sec. What happened?
Come back from Nirvikalpa Samadhi to us.
Get your computer over here.
We need you in the alpha, beta, gamma, and so forth, and so on and so on world.
I'll just keep talking, you'll hear me from a different device. I'm not sure what the hell happened. I will try to fix this as we go through, but we're almost finished. So the idea of brainwave therapy is that you have the ability of actively monitoring your brain activity as you react to things. So as your emotional state changes, you are able to witness your brain act, and you have the ability to focus on this and essentially react to yourself. With this, you're able to surprisingly well control your brainwave activity and engage in a form of focus that is very similar to meditation. Not the same. Obviously, it's a very active form of therapy, but it is surprisingly effective, as I mentioned. On the left, you see some general claims they have. And based on my knowledge of this effect and how it has worked for some people, as I mentioned, it is quite good and it should be engaged with if you feel like this is something that can suit you. Now then, final little part. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about as well was that we've essentially reached a near telepathic level of communication methods now. It is not science fiction, and for like a few years now, it has thought to be possible. And as of February 18th, met tremendous form of this. So one thing that brainwave activity can potentially do is map your inner, let's say, wave activity to specific thoughts. The problem was that doing so previously was very difficult because it was a manual form of labor of tracking what waves correspond to what. But with data science and AI, you can match a lot of more data more quickly, and you can focus on a specific person's brain activity extensively. And eventually what happens is that you can match their brain activity with their intended thought of, for instance, speech or images, which then leads to the ability to create a mind to text translation pattern. Essentially, telepathy. It's not perfectly accurate, it has flaws, but it does enable people to quite literally think in a language and have that printed in a model or a system or even a text to voice machine. And it is incredibly fascinating that we've reached a point where we could quite literally think, and that becomes information computers understand. So I've noted, oh, by the way, where that information is coming from so that if anyone is interested, they can look into it. But generally speaking, that's the type of stuff brain waves can do for you. It's not just about how it affects you in your yogi traditions, because yes, there's a lot of ways you can influence this in an internal level and engage in this practice just for the sake of practicing, and also getting more control over yourself, getting some forms of enlightenment, introspection, and deep techniques of control over your body. But you can quite literally at this point talk to your machine as well. So you can do both. And now, the reason why this lesson is going to be quite short is that I was planning on having an open discussion. Now, before we do, I'm going to reboot my machine and try to reconnect my everything, okay? I'm not gone, I'm still here. So I'll just reboot real quick. And thanking you all for putting up with this nonsense. So far, so good. We've gone through a lot of the material that I wanted to do in a relatively quick fashion. Now I would like to hear what everyone else thinks about these things. And if no one has any questions or thoughts, I'm gonna throw a few at you. So go ahead and ask me what you would like to know based on what you've seen so far, and I'll answer you to the best of my ability or give you references. Nothing?
Well, it's a lot of material. It's a lot, and you kind of for people to grasp them, because I don't think we have background in biology or neuroscience, that's difficult. That's just my assumption.
Oh,
It,
yes, I'm fully aware of this. That's why I'm asking you to essentially give me questions because I can delve closer into a lot of what's actually going on here. Because I simplified the material to the point where it's digestible within like 3 minutes or so, but I obviously glazed over an enormous amount of stuff so that I just gave you a bit of a taste of what's going on. But otherwise, I just chose this path so that everyone has a bit of a more equal chance to understand what's going on. Otherwise, I can obviously give you more.
yeah, so I think there are lots of what I'm interested in primarily is mostly the applicable part of meditation. There's lots of books, including the one that I mentioned, which is like meta-analysis of meditation, specifically done mostly by the Buddhist monks, some of the yogic monks, and TM practitioners, called Altered Traits. So my question is, or rather what I'm curious to know more about are the positive effects or the effects of doing meditation, and specifically in relation to, say, how does it affect the cognitive function? How does it change? How does it alter of the neural system?
Yes, give me a moment. I'm gonna pull up a text for you. So, long story short, there has been a bit of a, oh, thank you. There has been a bit of a sprout of data and knowledge when it comes to the different kinds of effects that yoga has on the mind. But generally speaking, if we're talking about the effect of yoga on psychic health, that one has always been quite self-evident, right? It makes you more calm, it makes you better self-control, it gives you the ability to feel more fulfilled. But when it comes to like specifically brain activity, the knowledge base is relatively limited. Even within the stuff he gave me, which unfortunately I wasn't able to actually open. I don't know why. My phone refused to open the link. I can also link the document here, which is essentially a short form format of the two articles I've used in order to give you the original slides. Essentially, the point is that every type of yogi tradition has the ability to expand upon a specific range of abilities, especially emotional abilities that you have. So, for instance, the certain techniques are very good at handling alpha waves, which generally speaking are things like alertness, relaxation, and internal memory. Your ability to influence these things essentially give you so much more room to explore things within yoga itself, but also within your own life. Now, the details of this are vague at best because there is very little science here. It's just anecdotal stuff a lot of the time. And it's when it's not anecdotal, the sample size of the people they're working with is too low to make any general conclusions. But there are a few general concepts that are very consistent across the board, the same ones we've been seeing across every other lessons we've seen so far, and a lot of what have done already. So let me just go through some of the more interesting stuff. Where was it? I remember. Oh, there it is. There it is. So if you're looking for a specific list of cognitive and like emotional benefits, here's a list for you. So you can look at it, you can see the same thing I've already said, but in more specific terminology. I think that I will specifically highlight the emotional stability part. People that practice yoga, and especially meditation techniques, do straight up just don't suffer from emotional instability past a certain point because they generally have the ability to focus and control themselves and specifically what state they wish to experience. There's obviously a limit to it, and specific life circumstances can push anyone over the limit. But better control over their emotional stability is something that has been generally seen across many different people when it comes to, for instance, yogi practice, and also, again, alpha wave management. Is there anything else you would like to know in your mall?
Well, this is just you're focusing on the on different types of rays, which is good. Different types of waves.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is neuroscience must be also focusing on other things like neuron function, right? Like nervous system, which includes endocrine system, other things like this.
Yeah, I did not go through that kind of material for this specific course. I was specifically focusing on brainwaves because it was the main theme. But if you're talking about details of neuroscience itself, my knowledge extends roughly to the basics of the transmission systems, the chemical disbalances related to depression, and variations of chemical disbalances and some how they are related to certain like consistently chronic diseases. But when it comes to like general effects of yoga on eliminating some of these things, my knowledge ends there because I know a lot of the trends and I can exponentiate on them. For instance, if you experience general calmness and less stress, you're less likely to experience heart disease and a lot of stress-related diseases. Like it's self-evident, right? It's basically an axiom at that point. But that is the extent of what I can say with absolute certainty. But if you know something that I pretend not know at the moment or did not disclose, please do. I'm not claiming to know everything here. No. All right. In that case, I will take the next 5 minutes to just jump questions at you, and specifically in relation to this little piece of news here. As you may know or may not know, I am a computer scientist. Although I'm still studying in computer science, I think of myself as a computer scientist. And the idea of translating a lot of stuff, for instance, that we can know from yoga into computers and how that applies in science is why I'm here and why I'm passionate about all this. One of the things that I would like to talk to you about and see what is your, let's say, interpretation of the situation is, should AI technology be used to scan and understand a human brain? To be more specific, this technology right here, although it has been already visualized and described in roughly 22, 23, and has been implemented, at least in a prototype form, like relatively recently in February. The direction this takes is that within a few years, if not a year, we'll be in a point where we can use AI extensions to our minds. And I'm not talking like a mouse or like smart glasses. I'm literally talking about thinking about something, then the AI interprets it, and then you're able to literally telepathically communicate to it or any other person that you want. How do you feel about this in terms of essentially ethics and practicality or spirituality? Because this is in part a spiritual problem too. Would we lose a lot of our human touch in communication, or is this completely fine by your manners? Please, your thoughts. Marina? I'll torture you first, just to break the ice.
Not sure. But how would it affect us?
You're still muted.
I know, but
Oh yeah, well yeah, the mic.
so what do you mean by that? What it would do?
Yeah, you're not hearing you very well. So what I mean is that one of the things people complain about, especially on social media over time, is that the distance in communication between people has become larger. As there's more information and there's more ways of talking to people, the methods by which you talk to people has dehumanized the person itself. You're no longer talking to a person, you're literally reading a comment through your screen that is supposed to symbolize that person's opinion. So you're not only not looking at a person, you're looking at an echo of an opinion that a person wrote somewhere in the past. And that is supposed to be personal or human communication in some form. Now, exponentiate this to this form of communication where you can literally think your thoughts into the computer and do the exact same thing faster. And not only that, but also talk to people without moving your mouth or even your body for that matter. I feel like this has a lot of potential, but it's also dystopian to a ridiculous degree. I am both excited and scared by this technology because, again, I was thinking about it myself, but I didn't think it would come this quickly. So my question to you in different terms now is what, in your opinion, is the potential impact this has on ethics and spirituality, and especially within yogic tradition? Because we are aiming to understand ourselves, and we hope to do so by not only talking to ourselves internally, but also by extending these feelings to other people. But technologies like this that could potentially be there instead of us could be a barrier. Or alternatively, it can open in a whole new world for you to talk and communicate with people. What is your opinion? Do you feel like this will help us, or this will be another TikTok brain rot moment? There we go. TikTok brain rot moment. That's how I would like to qualify it.
Okay, I have idea. So,
Go ahead.
so Srishanandamurti, interestingly, in one of the discourses, says that he's against the demilitarization. You know, this is a very controversial at first, it may seem, if you take it from look at it one angle. Say why, if yogis, if yeah, the first yama is non-violence, which in our tradition, in the yogic tradition, is you can say it's non-use of aggression or aspiration to use it very, very, you can say sparingly and only in the spirit of defense. So you use force, but you are not meant to use it to hurt and harm others. But the interesting thing is, Shishanandamurti says that the process of militarization is usually supported by science, because even talking with one of my friends all the worse, one thing they do, for better or for worse, and humanistically speaking, for worse, they usually boost scientific progress because there has to happen this kind of competition between different countries, different scientists, that they have to like think about solutions and invent weapons of more and more mass destruction. So kind of bringing this metaphor to the AI, but the thing is, AI is a tool, and the tool, just like the weapon, just like science, is being utilized by a human being, by a human intellect. So the central idea to yoga is that everything has to be based on the proper conduct. And the conduct is for what? This conduct is made for the brain, for the mind. And when the mind, when the character, when the personality is not balanced, they don't know how to control themselves, how to conduct themselves. When they don't have proper discipline, self-regulation, they will ruin themselves. And we know it from interdisciplinary traditions, say like developmental psychology. The entire idea of high-grade functioning, like altruism, prosocial behavior, cognitive skills, problem solving, all the things that make a human being social and quote unquote successful in the social arena, is all based on the idea of self-regulation. It's all based on the idea of character development. If the character is not developed, if you don't have self-regulation, well, good luck. You cannot really function much socially speaking, economically speaking. So I think AI is such a powerful tool, just like internet is such a powerful tool, just like Instagram was supposed to be not just to showcase
Unrealistic things.
unrealistic things, but also low-grade things like sexualizing people, like pornography. Well, not to that extent, but you know what I'm saying, kind of
Oh no, that's plenty there on Instagram. If you look at Reels, there is
objective.
little decapitation there in Instagram. I know that story.
Well, it's called objectivization. That's the word I was looking for. Not like pornography, but the same idea, using a human body as an object to activate, those uh, sexual things that marketers have been using, behaviorist psychologists had been using for centuries. And actually, the creator of the behavioral science, John Watson, was fired from the official psychological association, I found out, and he started working in marketing. And he was the one who said, well, human being is nothing but external behavior. We cannot go into the mind. We cannot study cognition. Let us focus on the external thing. So that was like the beginning of the psychological movement as a science in the US. I just find it fascinating. I just learned about it.
Yeah, psychology in the beginning was an absolute shit show. That's just one of the many stories where it's really funny. By the way, do you know about that story where a guy impersonated psychologists in Germany for over 2 months and actually did a better job than those psychologists at the time?
No, I don't know. But
Look
anyways,
it up.
I'll
It
look it up.
is hilarious.
So anyways, my whole point, AI is a tool. It's a powerful tool, like most of the things we have access to, and mostly we as society, I think educationally are not being able to catch up and meet the demands of what's going on. Because I'm looking at the mental health issues that are at place, the focus problems. I just spoke to a professor at the University of Ottawa, my friend. She says that in her class, out of 25 people, 5 people struggle with diagnosed neurodevelopmental issues, while five extra ones have like undiagnosed problems with self-regulation, with depression, with emotional regulation, with simple ability to focus. And so this is like systemic. This is a systemic issue, educational issue, well-being issue, and we have it in the so-called first world country in Canada. What to speak of the other countries?
So
So
I would
so
like to speak more on this since we still have like about 10 minutes. And that's precisely why I wanted to leave a little more space on this before the end of this little lesson. Also, I posted the name of the guy in the chat. By the way, he's still alive and he's still shit posting on Facebook. The point is that one of the more interesting ideas in philosophy that I feel people are both terrified and also like kind of like embracing at this point is the idea that humanity as a concept is beginning to change. The keenness, the closeness, the close and important empathy we used to feel for each other is now taking a back foot. For a society to be efficient and effective, a lot of these things need to be reduced to minimum, if not completely removed from the human psyche and existence. And there is an interesting thought experiment, if nothing else. If you are born from, let's say, a genetic modification of your body, and a lot of things, just like a psychopath, can be removed from you. For instance, a psychopath will not experience most of the emotions most people tend to experience. So if, for instance, a society needs that you become a docile potato that does everything you are told to do, and you exist for an abstract purpose you have no control or understanding of, and that is okay with you, then the society will make that happen. The point, however, is that under normal circumstances, humans are chaotic to the point where this isn't something you can do easily. And there's always going to be flaws in such a system that creates cracks and destroys the system. But at what point is the system so large and so powerful that even when you do rebel against the system and there are cracks in the system, that any of that even matters? One of the more terrifying ideas is that with the advent of technology and the removal of certain freedoms, people that embrace these technologies, these advantages, become so monumentally more powerful than people that don't, that the sheer difference in capacity between the two is ridiculous. So for instance, let's say in a few years from now, we're gonna have this dissection between the population that has access to AI and education to use AI and people that don't. Just think about the size of potential difference between the two sections of that population. The guy with the AI will be able to think and do whatever the hell they want at any point with somewhat good accuracy and use these models to achieve anything they want, good or bad. Well, the person that doesn't have access to such a model wouldn't even think about what they're missing out on because they quite literally don't have the information necessary to make that conclusion happen. And that discrepancy, not just in potential, but sheer knowledge and ability, is very frightening. But what also, on the other hand, you have elitists or people that believe that certain people should never have access to such power, and only a handful of brilliant individuals should have access to such enormous amount of knowledge and potential. And these people will lead society to a better tomorrow. So far, that hasn't shown to be an efficient way of thinking. People being people, no matter how smart or dumb, will always make mistakes, just different kinds. And that problem creates effects, ripples, destruction, and different kinds of economic incentives or just general incentives that move things in a weird direction. And yeah, Nirmal, we can continue from here.
I think there's a beautiful transition, and I think whatever is going on is going to challenge us positively in the sense that human beings, we kind of have to go back to the base. And I think the base really is, if you even look at the system of yoga, it all starts with conduct. The word yama means to control. These principles are guiding principles to help us regulate ourselves for the sake of warping working on the relationships, because this is really about having good relationships with ourselves first. And this is a big issue to overcome all of those negative thinking, things like emotional problems like depression, anxiety disorders, and so on and so forth. Everything happens everything is happening lots of problems are happening on the individual level right now in the society. And the thing is, I think there's no proper education on this, and no proper training. And this has to do with, you can say, mental hygiene, psychological hygiene, what we think, what we don't think, how we think. And because basically our thinking, cognitive habits, they inform our behavior. And this is very important. So I think we have to really, really rethink character education the way it is right now, because I don't think in the Canadian curriculum they're talking about it right now. But to talk about it right now, to put it in practice is another thing, to practice those things. And meditation, I think the beauty of it in the yogic tradition is that actually enhances, it encapsulates the practice of all the yamas, of non-violence, benevolent use of the mind, and so on and so forth. So you practice those values and you transform your character, and that's how you basically are able to play an important role in society.
Oh, and on that level, before we finish for today, there's another little discussion that I wanted to throw out there. One of the most common criticism of liberal ideas, such as, for instance, making the playing field equal between people, such as, for instance, giving people access to an AI despite not, for instance, having access to one. The main problem a lot of people criticize is that just because you give a person a powerful tool doesn't mean they know how to use it. And in a lot of cases, this leads to really problematic behavior, as like it's obvious. New York, by the way, is a prime example of this kind of mentality devolving into nonsense, where you give people a bunch of opportunities, but these people fundamentally are nowhere near the area or even thought mentality of doing good things with that power. So a lot of societies around the world, especially authoritarian societies, decide to indoctrinate specific cultures and ways of thought in order to have less social issues in their culture and society. And my question is such: how do we decide which form of society and which form of culture befits the human condition best? Because at the end of the world, at the end of the day, we really want cohesion. That's the one thing that we want. If everyone does roughly the same thing, we can expect the same thing from each other. It doesn't really matter what things or ideals we really work with, as long as we all understand each other. But that's not the reality we live in. We all have very different ideas about how things should be done. Yet things are done in a million different ways. So how can we, for instance, say that our current way of thinking, for instance, the yogi way, is the way that most people should adopt? And beyond that, at what point can we be so certain in our ideas that what we are currently thinking is correct enough to impose or propose as a better alternative to a more primitive or a more basic approach to life that may not be as sophisticated or as rich with history and context? Because in my mind, yes, it's obvious to me at least that certain things are better than others. But in what context and by what power? I think that's a very strange question that doesn't really have a straightforward answer.
There came an idea to my mind. I recently talked to Sahil Inayatullah, who is a doctor in his PhD he's a futurist coming from the political science background. And basically he's created this model which is called causal layer analysis. And he uses it for individuals, for organizations, and even countries, advising and doing workshops around countries. Basically, it's based on the idea of yoga that everything consists of different layers, how everything is multi-layered. So, and for example, to give you an example, in therapy, the most basic foundational form of therapy is behavioral therapy. So when, for example, a person has some addiction, like external, for example, consumption of alcohol, or there are, yeah, some drug addiction, whatever. And the thing is, the person comes with a very particular issue and says to the therapist, well, I want to consume less. And the therapist will be prescribing in this case. Oh, well, you came to this, you came with this goal, you want to consume less. Well, listen, this and this and this, yeah, this is what you have to do. You have to follow this advice, because the person, like, I'm simplifying it to the most degree, but usually the person who comes from with an addiction has an extreme level of distress, and he or she has to be helped right away, and they want to be given advice what to follow, just do or not do. It's basically like a child coming to a grown up and being told what to do, because otherwise, no, they need to act fast. When the person, however, we're going deeper now. When the problem is, the person is, oh, why am I doing this? What's the deeper thing? What's the cause behind the problem? I don't want to just, treat the symptom. I don't want to just treat the effect. I want to treat the cause. I want to understand. There you have psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is for, you can say, not a grown up yet, but also like for a grown up or a teenager. Somebody who is like not a grown up already, but is all there. He wants to start solving problems. Psychoanalysis, you have to go deeper to this root. You have to work on the cause. However, if you constantly focusing on the past, you will be always trapped in this idea. It is a very long, lengthy process. And then the next step, or the ultimate step, you have like therapies like Gestalt, which Gestalt means whole or integral. It's based by Fritz Perls, and it means it's kind of semi-spiritual, because it means focusing on here and now. And then you have humanists like Carl Rogers and other people who will be like, focus on what works, focus on what positive, forget about this and this in the past, forget about trauma, just you're whole, you're good, you're a human being, focus on what's working and just keep doing the good things. So you can see, but that thing is only available to the person who's already kind of transitioned, who has who's already, as Maslow would say, a realized person, more or less, self-actualized person. So for each kind of problem, there is a particular kind of solution. So a person usually, like I was listening to Sadananda, he's an Acharya of Ananda Marga, and he had this interview with a Canadian therapist originally from Russia. And basically he said, and I agree, I'm not sure if Shishanandamurti has written about it, but yoga, the system, is more or less for people who are well aware, or more or less already, at least higher lessons of yoga are for people who are stable. For people who are stable, more or less mature, and more or less integrated. However, no, now I want to correct myself. Baba said his difference in terms of yoga, his attitude is yoga is for everybody. However, not every person is ready for all kind of things, for the higher levels. However, there must be things that the person can already start doing and benefit right away. For example, diet. For example, physical exercises. For example, yama niyama. This is like the basics. Means like conduct, like social norms.
Pretty much. Although we should probably end it here, since it's about 10 o'clock. Before we go, how do